Sergio Perez's exit from Red Bull Racing is now official. And Scott, while this may have been something that we saw coming, we can't overlook the fact that Red Bull gave this man a new contract earlier this year, and now they are tearing it up. So how do you even do that? How do you go from giving him a new contract in, what was it, May sort of time, June time, to then having to rip it up in December?
Yes, it's gone from that new deal in June. It was announced, but it was basically done at the end of May. That tied Checo to the team until the end of 2026, and now we are in December 2024, and he's out the door. And one of the only things that made sense at the time, because that new contract actually came just after Checo's decline started in 24. It wasn't obvious. Monaco was obviously very, very bad, but actually it started a race before that, really, at Imola. What was the only thing that really made sense about it was whether it made it easier for Red Bull to jettison Perez further down the line. If there was an exit clause or some kind of break clause in there, some kind of contractual requirement that if Checo fell short of it, Red Bull could get rid of him easier. But that didn't seem to be the case. So the short answer to the main part of the question is effectively a payoff. We don't know exactly how much. Helmut Marko has used his column in Red Bull Owned Speed Week to say that some of the numbers that have done the rounds are incorrect. For some clarity, in Abu Dhabi and even in Qatar, the numbers that we were hearing was that Checo was holding out for as much as $35 or $50 million because it's a 2-year deal. It's his salary. It's his own endorsements that go along with that. And it's also future earnings as well. You know, I guess you could argue if you're going to really stick, because it's just business at this stage, it's not personal. Checo has a contract. You're going to look at it from, right, what are my future earnings? What do I lose because I've lost 2 years of being a successful Red Bull Formula One driver? Because in his mind, that's what he would be if he continued. So don't know the exact numbers, but they would have had to have come to some kind of agreement. It's all about the compensation. Red Bull knew it was going in this direction for a long time. The ideal scenario of Checo just waking up one day and saying, I can't be bothered with this anymore, better just retire, was never likely to happen and hasn't happened. So it's just taken some protracted negotiations to get to a stage where both sides are happy with the amount being paid and being paid to them.
That is certainly money worth holding on for as well. I never thought the retirement thing made sense. No matter how many struggles Checo has had, if you have a contract that says you're going to race for Red Bull for a couple more years, you're not going to turn that down because you are always going to believe, and he did believe, that one day it might come good for him again. You mentioned there, though, that Red Bull have had this in mind for a while, and that's one of the things that troubles me about this a bit, is that I feel that if Red Bull has known this was coming, and it's just been a case of waiting to the end of the year to talk business, as you put it, I think it's a shame that Checo hasn't had the opportunity to go onto the driver market for 2025, because whatever's happened to him at Red Bull, and this decline has been severe, particularly this year, if he was available when there were seats available on the grid, there would be midfield and lower grid teams who would still look at him and go, we know he's the sort of driver that can do a job for us. In the end, he's out and he's got no options for 2025. So is this it for Checo in F1?
It certainly is, obviously, for 2025. The initial impression is that Checo's got no desire to just walk away and call it quits right here, right now, that's it, done. There are opportunities on the horizon in 2026, not least with the Cadillac Formula One team, of course, an American Formula One team with Checo being such a huge asset in not just Mexico, but Central American, Latin American market. That would be, I think that would be a fantastic tie-up. I think
Agreed.
Cadillac would get a huge amount out of a driver like Checo, who, while not capable of doing the job Red Bull needs, doesn't mean he doesn't have a place in Formula One. It was a little bit like when he fell off, or was going to fall off the grid in the first place, and Red Bull saved him from the scrap heap. You know, he was doing a very good job in the Racing Point in the midfield. Now, maybe that car was capable of even better. We won't know because it was Perez and Lance Stroll driving it, but he still won a race that year. He scored podiums, did a really good job in 2020. That's the kind of upper limit, really, of the level that Perez can operate at in the midfield. So he still has something to offer. And it is a shame that it hasn't been able to be reconciled in a way that allowed him to do that. The flip side of that is that Checo doesn't want to just make up the numbers. And I don't think a driver of his experience now and the success he's been able to have, particularly with Red Bull, should be making up the numbers in Formula One. So if it was a case of see this out to the bitter end with Red Bull and try to save it versus scramble around for a Sauber drive or something like that on a 1 or 2 year deal, I can see why you'd absolutely go completely for the glory of Red Bull. And like, the worst case scenario is exactly what Perez is in now. He's going to be paid a certain amount of money not to race next season, and he can get his ducks in a row and try and come back in 2026. If that doesn't work, he'll find another opportunity outside of Formula One, I'm sure.
He's also quite a dangerous driver to have on the sidelines next year. Anyone who's underperforming next year, there'll be teams going, I wonder if we can get Perez for the final part of this season. So I can see him looming over the lower half of the F1 grid as a bit of a dangerous presence. Now, his time at Red Bull has been a real roller coaster. There were dips even in the good years, but it always seemed to turn around eventually, or he'd start the next season well. It's crazy to look back at the early part of 2024, and there he was. He was at the front of the grid. He was doing what he was supposed to do. And then this time, though, was the fall from that height just too big to recover from? Did Red Bull just see that this time there was no coming back?
Yeah, you're right. In 22, there was a run of races in the middle of the year where Checo had, I think it was like 2 or 3 podiums in 8 races or something like that, and it was a wobble. But he came back from it. He won in Singapore. He took aim at a few people. I think we might have been included in that at the time. But that was kind of part and parcel of adjusting still to Red Bull, because the 21 Red Bull didn't suit him. 22 was a bit kinder, but the Red Bull advantage wasn't properly baked in at that point. But that dip did coincide with Verstappen winning races more often than not. Go forward to 2023, it happens on an even bigger scale. Longer run of races, hardly any podium finishes in that, in a season of unprecedented Red Bull and Verstappen domination. But again, Perez came out of it at the back end of the season with some podium finishes. And last year, remember, closed out second place in the Drivers' Championship. Now, he should have done that. Verstappen scored enough points last year to have won the Constructors' Championship on his own for Red Bull. So it wasn't like
Red
Perez
Bull's
was doing
first ever 1-2 in the Drivers' Championship as well, though.
It was, yeah, and it just showed, a driver of Mark Webber's calibre wasn't able to do that in the Sebastian Vettel era. So, it was an achievement that Red Bull's very proud of and grateful to Checo for, much like his contributions in 2021. You remember the battle with Lewis Hamilton in Turkey, and then, of course, in Abu Dhabi, the crucial season finale. Perez played a key role in that. When he started 24 the way that he did, I think it was 3 1-2 finishes in the first 5 or 6 races. He was ably supporting Verstappen in a really, really strong way. It would have been unthinkable back then to believe that it would fall off to the extent that it has. The problem is unlike the last couple of years, Red Bull hasn't had the car advantage that has carried Checo through those bad moments, because in 22 and 23, those bad days were still sort of top 6 finishes. He has hardly scored points in the second half of the season. Since the summer break, he's scored points as if he's driving a midfield car. And that Red Bull's got worse, relatively speaking to the others, but it's not a midfield car because Verstappen's still been able to win races and ultimately win the championship by a comfortable margin.
So let's look beyond Perez then. We know, everybody knows by this stage, that Liam Lawson is the driver who's got the nod to go alongside Verstappen in the second Red Bull. Was it close between him and Yuki Tsunoda? We only saw Yuki testing a Red Bull for the first time straight after Abu Dhabi, and the team said nice things. There was some fighting talk from Yuki. Did he ever have a shot?
It's really hard to know. Not definitively. I feel like some people within Red Bull made their minds up on Yuki years ago and don't want to change it. And
that's a shame, isn't it? Because he's still developing and doing a really good job.
I mean, imagine if you judged Verstappen and made all your decisions on Verstappen based on how he was in the first couple of years of Formula 1. I'm not trying to compare the two and say Tsunoda's capable of doing what Max has done. But you'd have looked at Verstappen and just gone, oh, he's coming to Formula 1 too young. He's quick, but he makes some mistakes, and he's a bit too aggressive and a bit too wild. He's never gonna pull it together. That's absolutely nonsense. Now Tsunoda, it's not a like for like, of course, but Tsunoda has shown time and time again that he is capable of, I think, reining in his emotional side better than ever before. It's still a weakness. He admits that. His team admits that. Racing Bulls, the second Red Bull team, say that it's still something he's got to work on, but he has been trying to improve it. At the same time, he's improved his technical feedback. Helmut Marko's even said that that's been better than has been sort of speculated upon. But it's Red Bull that has caused that speculation. Red Bull are known to have been unconvinced by that side of Tsunoda's game. That seemed to emerge from when he was alongside Daniel Ricciardo at the second team, and Ricciardo was a bit more impressive in the engineering room, or so Red Bull led us to believe. The other element, of course, is his speed, which is absolutely no question. But as one person at Red Bull sort of indicated to me, it's not the speed with Tsunoda, it's a bunch of other stuff. I am really struggling to see how compelling that other stuff can be, given the alternative is a driver who I think has 11 Grand Prix starts to his name, isn't as fast as Tsunoda, and may just end up another young driver who has been promoted alongside Verstappen too soon without the experience to back it up. I find it amazing that Tsunoda's not at least been given a chance.
Yeah, same. It feels really strange to me that he's been eliminated from the conversation effectively from the start. But you've brought up the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is Liam Lawson made an impressive first impression in 2023. Has certainly not done a bad job when he came back into what we're now calling racing bulls in 2024. But as you said there, so few F1 starts, and you're already going in to a team that wants, the part of the reason this team is making a change is because it wants to fight for the Constructors' Championship again. This is a high pressure situation. Is this too high risk from Red Bull?
It's certainly high risk. If it's too high risk, we'll find out in a few months' time. But based on the evidence of the last few times, plural, that Red Bull's done this, it won't work, because you have to go back to Verstappen to see it working. And I don't think Lawson's a Verstappen. I think he's more in a Pierre Gasly, Alex Albon, Daniel Kvyat mould. A driver who can probably do a job in the senior team in the right environment. You give him a good car, you give him a good surroundings, you give him a good platform to do it from, i.e. more than 11 races in Formula 1, and I'm sure he could show his best and probably be a strong support act. I don't think Lawson's going there to be a number one driver. I'd be surprised if he can establish himself as that. As I said, I think Tsunoda's faster, and I think between the experience that Tsunoda has and the speed that he has, I just think Tsunoda would probably have been able to cope with the situation a little bit better. That said, Red Bull's extremely, extremely impressed with Lawson's composure and his confidence. He's incredibly robust on track and off it. So where Red Bull, I think, sees promise with Lawson is Tsunoda they rate really highly from a speed point of view. So if Lawson can come in with his level of inexperience in difficult scenarios, this isn't just a rookie who has come in and from the start of his rookie season done well against Tsunoda. He's been parachuted in mid-season twice now and come pretty close to a driver that they think's pretty quick. So they kind of feel like, okay, he might not have that last edge of speed, but one, that might come with a little bit more time. And two, if he's got all of the other things that they really like, that might be enough to make the difference. So a little bit like Perez was back at the end of 2020. I don't think Lawson's the ideal Red Bull solution, but he might be the solution that Red Bull thinks it needs to the very specific current problem. And it's just going to be something that they still have to fix longer term, further down the line.
Yeah, and I guess when he's had such a short amount of time in F1, the level he's at now shouldn't be the level that he stays at. But you're talking there really about the kind of production line of Red Bull talent, something they used to be famed for. Looking at this in a positive way, is this potentially Red Bull getting back on track with that? We've got a long-term Red Bull junior going from the second team into the top team. It appears, is going to be replaced by a Red Bull junior who's been coming up the ladder in Isaac Hadjar, racing in F2. He's done the whole thing in a Red Bull liveried car and all of that. This is the pipeline again. So is this actually Red Bull getting all of its ducks back in a row?
Yeah, it's kind of corrective action from the last few years where it's kind of lost its way. Perez was a needs must stopgap that turned into I think probably lasted at least a year or two longer than Red Bull probably thought it would to start with. And you look at kind of what happened, like we always say when we're talking about Red Bull, you chart it back to Daniel Ricciardo leaving, and they had to put Pierre Gasly in when they didn't think Gasly was ready, and then they chucked Gasly out basically the first chance they got. They threw Albon in, and Albon was a driver who Red Bull had already dumped way back when as a junior, when he'd come out of karting and into car racing. They'd pulled him back when he was meant to be going into Formula E because they had a gap to fill. That was at the time where they didn't want to put Daniel Kvyat in the senior team again because they'd already sacked him a couple of times, re-promoted him and all of that nonsense. And you just ended up in a scenario where like the conveyor belt had been producing the drivers, but they'd either been sort of thrown off way earlier in the process, or they'd got to the end and Red Bull had gone, no thank you, and tossed them aside. So we've just ended up in this gap where Red Bull hasn't had drivers for the second team, let alone the top team. If you don't have drivers in the second team to train for the first team, where's your top team opportunities going to come from? Bringing back Daniel Ricciardo is another example of that. He was basically a stopgap for the stopgap, or a backup for the stopgap in Perez. If Perez didn't work, which it didn't, but then Ricciardo didn't work, so they couldn't put him in. And it's just become a mess. So what they've done with the second team, Racing Bulls, is they still want it to be something that justifies its own existence competitively, works financially. It's got some great commercial partners on board now, but it needs to also function within the Red Bull ecosystem, which is why getting it back into being something that trains young drivers is a core part of its remit going forward. The team bosses there are happy with that. Lauren Meckiers, Peter Bayer spoke to them at the end of the 24 season. They understand that is their responsibility. I don't have a problem with that. I think Hadjar, whether or not he can be a Red Bull Racing driver, is still to be determined, but he absolutely deserves to be in Formula 1 in a Red Bull car, based off of the fact that he fought for the Formula 2 title so closely this season. The person I still feel sorry for in all of this is Tsunoda, because he's basically nothing more than a glorified benchmark.